On the night of the 19th of August 1989, the River Thames carried more than the reflections of London's bright lights. Music and laughter filled a pleasure cruiser named the Marchioness as she slipped away from Charing Cross Pier on a journey carrying 131 people, most of them young, and unaware that within minutes their celebration would be violently cut short by one of the most serious peacetime disasters in the Thames' modern history. The Marchioness had been privately chartered to celebrate the 26th birthday of Antonio de Vasconcellos, with a party organised by close friend Jonathan Fang, and the atmosphere on board reflected that purpose. There was a disco, a buffet and a fully stocked bar, and the plan was to cruise gently along the Thames until the early hours of the morning, before returning everyone safely to dry land as the sun rose over the city. For more than 6 decades, the Marchioness had been part of life on the Thames. Built in 1923 as a passenger steamer, she was originally designed to carry sightseers and day trippers along the river at a time when Thames travel was a routine part of London life. Measuring just under 26 metres in length and weighing approximately 140 tonnes, she was a relatively small vessel built for calm river conditions. Over the years she lived many lives, serving as one of the little ships during the evacuation of Dunkirk, before returning to civilian service. In later decades, she was refitted once again, this time as a floating venue for the parties and celebrations that had become part of the city's modern nightlife. On this particular night, the Marchioness was under the command of Stephen Faldo, an experienced Thames waterman who knew the river well and who was assisted by his mate Andrew McGowan. Alongside them were 2 additional crew members working behind the bar and responsible for the practicalities of the evening, while Faldo and McGowan focused on navigating the vessel safely through the busy tidal waters of central London. It was a warm, clear summer night, with good visibility on the river. And shortly after 1:25 a.m, the Marchioness slipped away from the pier and headed east towards Greenwich, joining a busy stretch of water where pleasure cruisers, commercial vessels and working ships all shared the same dark tidal Thames. Among those vessels was the Bowbelle, a suction dredger at nearly 80 metres long with a dead weight of 1,850 tonnes, built for heavy industrial work. Her role was to remove sediment from the riverbed, an essential but unglamorous task that kept the shipping channel navigable for large commercial traffic. Broad-beamed and powerfully built, she was a ship built for function rather than finesse, and on that night she was travelling unladen without the weight of dredged material in her hold. As a result, her bow sat higher in the water than usual, worsening an already significant blind spot ahead of the wheelhouse, particularly in the confined and light-strewn environment of central London. Designed for endurance rather than manoeuvrability, the Bowbelle's size and mass set her apart from the smaller pleasure cruisers sharing the river that night. She carried a crew of 9, with at least 2 stationed forward on the bow as lookouts, but communication with the wheelhouse was limited. As the dredger overtook smaller vessels on her way downstream, the margin for error narrowed, and with every passing second the gap between safe navigation and catastrophe continued to close. Just before 1:46 a.m, the danger became apparent on both vessels almost at the same moment. As the partygoers settled into the celebration, dancing to the music as they passed near Cannon Street Bridge, events were unfolding very differently aboard the Bowbelle, where crew members stationed forward on the bow suddenly saw the pleasure cruiser alarmingly close ahead and shouted warnings back towards the wheelhouse. Those on board the Marchioness became aware of the looming presence of the dredger behind them, and urgent shouts were raised on the bridge. As the 2 vessels converged, the smaller boat was forced across the dredger's bow, placing her directly in the path of the much larger ship. On a crowded, fast-moving river there was no longer enough time or distance for human reaction to overcome the momentum and the mass involved. Annette Russell, a friend and colleague of Antonio, was on the upper deck when a friend suddenly shouted, "Annette, look at that, it's going to hit us!" And she turned just in time to see the vast bow of the dredger bearing down on them. Moments later, the Bowbelle struck the Marchioness from behind, driving her beneath the dredger's bow and sealing her fate within seconds. Water poured into the Marchioness almost immediately, rushing through damaged sections of the hull as the vessel was driven under by the force of the collision. Within moments, the lights failed and the music stopped, plunging the interior into darkness. In less than 30 seconds, the boat was completely submerged, taking with her dozens of people who had barely begun to comprehend what was happening, let alone find a way out. Annette Russell was knocked off into the water and immediately dragged downstream. The boat was sinking, the current was strong, and fear and confusion spread rapidly through the crowded compartments. Odette Penwarden described it like going into a washing machine. Other survivors later spoke of seeing water rise through windows as the floor tilted beneath them and the music cut out suddenly. Ian Philpott recalled, "Through the window we could see the water building up as the stern was being pushed. The lights went out and we knew the water had got into the hull." Then there was the terrifying realization that the vessel was not simply damaged, but being forced under. In the darkness that followed, people called out to one another and tried to make sense of what was happening before the river finally overwhelmed the interior spaces. Andrew McGowan, the Marchioness's mate, was thrown into the Thames on impact, and yet somehow managed to climb back onto the capsized hull and force open a door leading to the dance floor, an action that is believed to have saved the lives of several passengers who would otherwise have been trapped inside. Others escaped only when parts of the saloon were torn away by the violence of the collision. As the wreckage disappeared, debris rose to the surface. Life jackets, furniture, and anything buoyant enough to keep exhausted swimmers afloat. Some clung to beer barrels, others to fragments of the boat itself as the strong current began to carry them away from the site of the collision. Although vessels in the vicinity were instructed to assist with the rescue effort, the Bowbelle did not remain at the scene. Despite being undamaged, the dredger continued downriver, putting distance between herself and the location where the Marchioness had gone down. Shortly after the collision, her captain, Douglas Henderson, made a radio transmission to the Thames Navigation Service, explaining his actions as the vessel cleared the bridges. "I have to get underway now and proceed out through the bridges. I believe I have struck a pleasure craft. It has sunk. I am getting clear of the bridges now. I was distracted by flashing lights from another pleasure craft. My vessel was proceeding outward bound, just approaching the Cannon Street Bridge, and I just lost steerage. And I don't know after that. I can't really say anything else." While the Bowbelle moved away, rescue began, not through formal command, but through proximity. Crews aboard nearby pleasure cruisers, including the Hurlingham and the Royal Princess, were the first to act, throwing flotation aids into the water and pulling survivors from the river as police boats converged on the area and emergency services mobilised along the banks. The response was immediately complicated by the nature of the Thames itself. The strong tidal current swept people and debris rapidly downstream, so that within just 15 minutes of the collision, survivors were being sighted as far as half a mile from the point where the Marchioness had sunk. By the time coordinated rescue efforts were fully underway, the river had already scattered the consequences of the disaster far beyond the site of impact. By morning, helicopters and divers were searching the Thames, but no further survivors were found. All the people who lived had been rescued within the first half hour of the incident. There were 131 people aboard the Marchioness that night. 80 were pulled from the river alive, but 51 would never hear music again. Among those who lost their lives were Antonio de Vasconcelos, whose birthday was being celebrated, the vessel's captain, Stephen Faldo, a young couple, Julie Ibbotson and Rupert Blackburn, who went on to be buried side by side, Francesca Dallaglio, the sister of former England rugby captain Lawrence Dallaglio, and Sean Lockwood Croft, who just wanted to have some fun with his friends. The average age of the passengers was just 22. For those who survived, events moved quickly and chaotically. Many were pulled from the river by nearby pleasure cruisers and police boats, cold, injured and in shock after being carried downstream by the tide while clinging to debris. As emergency services took control, survivors were brought ashore at multiple points along the Thames, with ambulances positioned at bridges along the river. Some were treated on the banks, wrapped in blankets and given oxygen, while others were taken directly to hospital. Several were suffering from hypothermia, cuts and broken bones, while others appeared physically unharmed but were deeply distressed. Unfortunately, some survivors later recalled feeling that emergency services appeared more concerned with checking them for AIDS than with treating their immediate injuries. In 1989, fear and misunderstanding surrounding HIV and AIDS were still widespread, fueled by years of sensationalist reporting and limited public knowledge about how the virus was transmitted. Those fears often translated into suspicion and stigma, particularly in situations involving blood, water and trauma. In the aftermath of the Marchioness disaster, this prejudice surfaced in disturbing ways. Media reports emerged suggesting that police had labelled the victims as gays and lesbians, a characterisation that deeply angered grieving parents and families who felt their loved ones were being reduced to stereotypes rather than treated as individuals. At the same time, sections of the press described the passengers as yuppies, a term loaded with resentment towards young, affluent professionals, and one that seemed to dull public sympathy for the scale of the loss. For survivors, the implication was painful. Odette Penwarden later reflected on the atmosphere surrounding the response, saying, "It was almost as if they thought, 'Serves you yuppies right.'" For many families, the sense that prejudice had crept into both the emergency response and the public narrative added another layer of hurt because many of them were wealthy, and this seemed to dull the degree of sympathy that the tragedy so clearly warranted. Those who were pulled from the river quickly realised how close they had come to not surviving at all. One survivor, Simon Hook, later reflected, "I was alive and I was grateful for that, but it was impossible to feel anything like relief." As dawn broke, survivors were gradually reunited with family and friends, but with little immediate support for the psychological trauma that would linger long after the night had ended. Immediately after the sinking, the focus remained on rescue rather than recovery. But once it became clear that there were no more survivors to be found, the operation shifted to locating the wreck and recovering those still missing. The Marchioness had sunk quickly and come to rest on the bed of the River Thames, close to where the collision occurred, but the river itself made the task difficult. The strong tidal current, poor underwater visibility and the debris field left behind by the sinking all complicated efforts to pinpoint the vessel's exact position. Later on the morning of the 20th of August, police and specialist divers were brought in to search the riverbed. By early afternoon, the wreck of the Marchioness was located. She was found lying on her side, partially buried in silt, with parts of the structure badly damaged by the collision. Because of the condition of the vessel and the possibility that victims were still trapped inside, the recovery was carried out with caution. Divers entered the wreck to confirm its position and assess whether bodies remained within the hull before any attempt was made to raise it. Specialist lifting equipment and cranes were brought in, and the vessel was raised later the same day during a suitable tidal window. As the vessel was raised, water and debris poured from the damaged compartments. A specialist police recovery team then began the grim task of searching the interior. 24 bodies were recovered from inside the wreck during this process, but the work did not end there. For days afterwards, the Thames and its banks were searched as the tide carried victims far from where the vessel had gone down, while sections of the river were closed and traffic restricted as recovery and investigation continued. The full recovery took just over a week to complete, and by the time the river had returned to its usual rhythm, nothing else had. For the families, the shock of loss was compounded by a series of deeply distressing decisions made during the identification process, decisions that caused lasting pain and anger. At the direction of the coroner, Dr. Paul Knapman, the hands of some victims were removed to facilitate fingerprint identification. The temporary mortuary facility did not have the capacity to house such a large number of bodies at once, and officials were under pressure to identify victims quickly. Because many of the bodies had been in the River Thames for some time, decomposition made it difficult to obtain fingerprints using standard methods, leading to the decision to remove hands for identification. Crucially, many families were not told at the time that this had been done. For some, the truth only emerged years later during subsequent legal proceedings and public inquiries, adding a further layer of shock and distress to an already devastating loss. More than a decade after the Marchioness sank, families returned to Westminster not simply looking for answers about the collision itself, but about what happened to their loved ones afterwards. They hoped the inquiry would finally explain how the identification process had gone so badly wrong and ensure that no other families would ever endure the same experience. Opening the hearings, Lord Justice Clerk acknowledged the depth of the harm that had already been done, describing the removal of victims' hands for fingerprinting as a cause of profound shock and distress. In total, the hands of 25 victims were removed. Families were told they could not see the bodies before burial or cremation because their condition would be too upsetting. For many, that decision caused more pain than it prevented. Sally Smith later told the inquiry that when she saw photographs of her daughter, she knew immediately she could have identified her herself. She said she had prepared herself for injuries caused by the accident, but nothing prepared her for the knowledge that her daughter's hands had been removed. That, she said, was worse than actually knowing about the disaster. Her daughter was ultimately identified using the same personal details Sally had given from the very start. Survivors also spoke of confusion and disorder. Annette Russell, who lost several friends, described a process marked by silence and contradiction, saying there was a continual lack of facts and communication, and that everything about it felt chaotic and shambolic. She was asked to check some identification records of an Australian friend, but she was perplexed to see so many errors in the report. She said, "They stated my friend was white. She wasn't, she was black. They said she didn't have pierced ears. She did. They said she was 5'9". She was 5'5". It broke my heart. Why didn't they just let me identify her in the first place? I have to choose a coffin, and I paid for it, but to this day I still don't know whether I sent the right body home to her family in Australia." And she wasn't the only one misidentified. Judy Wellington told the inquiry that her son Simon's hands had been removed and that the family was initially given the wrong body altogether. A white man, despite Simon being of Caribbean origin. All of these decisions had been taken by officials who believed visual identification would be too traumatic, even though families had provided detailed descriptions and, in many cases, dental records were available. Lord Justice Clerk made clear that his task was to uncover what had happened and make recommendations, not to conduct a witch hunt, even as questions lingered about the coroner's role in decisions that would haunt families long after the river had been cleared and the headlines had faded. In the years that followed the disaster, attempts to establish criminal responsibility proved deeply frustrating for survivors and families. The captain of the Bowbelle, Douglas Henderson, was charged on 2 separate occasions with failing to keep a proper lookout. During proceedings, it emerged that Henderson had spent part of the evening drinking in local pubs before returning to the vessel to rest ahead of its departure, a decision that would later be criticised. Both trials, however, ended with deadlocked juries, unable to reach a verdict, and the Crown Prosecution Service ultimately decided not to pursue the case further. Henderson was formally acquitted, not because the deaths were found to be lawful, but because prosecutors concluded there was insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. A full public inquiry chaired by Lord Justice Clerk was eventually convened to examine what had gone wrong. Its findings were critical of several aspects of river safety at the time, including inadequate lookout practices, limitations in vessel design that restricted visibility, and broader failures in the management and regulation of traffic on the Thames. The inquiry also condemned the lack of a dedicated emergency response on the river and highlighted systemic weaknesses rather than a single catastrophic error. Yet despite these findings, the inquiry stopped short of assigning personal blame. Responsibility was spread across institutions, procedures and long-standing practices, rather than resting with any one individual. For those who had lost loved ones, this distinction offered explanation, but little sense of closure. What troubled many families even more was the knowledge that the Bowbelle had not been an unknown quantity on the Thames. Unbelievably, this was not the first time the Bowbelle had been involved in a collision. In the years leading up to the Marchioness disaster, the dredger had been linked to a number of incidents on the river, raising concerns about her operation and handling. Most disturbingly, she had previously struck Cannon Street Bridge itself, the very stretch of water where the Marchioness would later sink, a coincidence that would feel deeply unsettling in hindsight. Compensation was eventually paid, but many families felt it fell far short of reflecting the scale of their loss, particularly for young victims whose lives had scarcely begun. What remained was a sense that accountability had been diluted, even as lessons were slowly absorbed. Two undeniable changes did emerge from the tragedy. One of the harsh realities exposed that night was that for some victims, survival ended not in the river itself but at its edge. Even those who managed to reach the bank often found themselves unable to climb out. Much of the Thames is lined with steep stone embankments offering little grip and no clear escape for people who were exhausted, injured, weighed down by wet clothing and still fighting the pull of the tidal current. In the aftermath of the Marchioness disaster, survivor testimony made it clear that reaching the side of the river was often not enough. Now, this understanding led to quieter but vital changes along the Thames. Grab chains and escape points were installed along key stretches of the embankment, giving people in the water something to hold on to and a means of pulling themselves clear. It was a recognition, born of tragedy, that rescue is not only about reaching someone in the water, but about giving them a way to leave it. The disaster also exposed a more fundamental absence. At the time, there was no dedicated lifeboat service responsible for the River Thames, despite it being one of the busiest and most complex waterways in the country. Rescue depended largely on police boats, passing vessels and the chance proximity of help, a reality laid bare in the early hours of that morning. In the years that followed the disaster, attempts to establish criminal responsibility proved deeply frustrating for survivors and families, and this prompted Margaret Lockwood Croft, the mother of Sean Lockwood Croft, to help set up the Marchioness Action Group. One of the 51 people who died when the Marchioness sank was her son, and Margaret's grief quickly turned into determination when she was denied the chance to see his body or understand what had been done to him after death. When she asked for a lock of Sean's thick dark hair and was told the body in the sealed coffin was bald, her unease hardened into fear. Years of persistent questioning eventually revealed that Sean's hands had been removed during the identification process without her knowledge, leaving her haunted by doubts about whether he had even been correctly identified. Refusing to let those questions be quietly buried, Margaret brought together families and survivors to demand answers, accountability and dignity for the dead. Through sustained pressure, the group forced a full public inquiry into the disaster and its aftermath, exposed serious failures in victim identification and river safety, and played a key role in driving lasting changes on the Thames, including the introduction of dedicated river lifeboat services. In 2002, a network of 24-hour river lifeboat stations was introduced in central London. These stations transformed safety on the Thames. Help would no longer depend on chance or proximity, but on a dedicated service designed for the river's unique demands. Though the change came too late for those who lost their lives aboard the Marchioness, it remains a lasting legacy forged from loss and persistence. Today, a memorial inside Southwark Cathedral bears the names of the 51 people who lost their lives in the Marchioness disaster. Set within the nave and overlooking the Thames, it offers a quiet place of reflection close to the river where the tragedy unfolded. The memorial was unveiled in 1991 at a service attended by Diana, Princess of Wales, her presence giving public recognition to the depth of loss felt by families who had fought to ensure their loved ones were not forgotten. The plaque itself speaks not of blame, but of remembrance, recording the date of the disaster and honouring those who died that night. It bears a single line: "Many waters cannot quench love." Simple and restrained, it carries a meaning shaped by what came before and what followed. The river was cold and unforgiving, and yet it could not erase the bonds between those who were lost and those who continue to remember them. The Marchioness disaster was not defined solely by the moment of impact, but by everything that followed. Lives cut short, questions left unanswered, and changes forged from grief. For families and survivors, the Thames is no longer just a river that runs through London, but a place permanently marked by absence. And yet, in the lifeboats that patrol its waters, in the memorials that stand along its banks, and in the determination of those who refuse to let the story fade, something endures. Many waters could not quench that love, and they never will. Obviously, this was a terrible tragedy. I myself am from London, and I know the Thames very well. And on dark nights, despite the lights reflecting from the embankments, as you look out over the river, it can be very dark and foreboding. And I can't understand what would have gone through the minds of the people as they floundered in the water. Our condolences go out to the families of the people who lost their lives, and our best wishes to the people who probably are still to this day recovering from this terrible tragedy. I hope you like the way the material was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.